Our guest today, our good friend Stephen Yates, who is, you can find him on Twitter at YatesComms, and he, he's a foreign policy expert, previously advised former Vice President Dick Cheney during the Bush administration, and he's still traveling, still globetrotting. He was in D.C. recently, and Stephen, first off, happy Monday to you. You were forced into wearing the face diaper, weren't you, being out in D.C.?
Well, I have worn a mask from time to time. In this particular instance, I was in a freer part of the former republic, and then I came back to DC. And in order to take a ride service to just get to my home, I did have to put this ever important cloth on my face out of respect to my driver to make my way home. But I mean, I just really feel like they have completely lost the country, common sense, and the narrative on all of this stuff. I find very, very reasonable people who don't share my politics that are just sort of gobsmacked about, wait a minute, you said masks worked, and a year and a half in, you're still saying the mask up, and it's a one-trick pony. It's all you got. Yeah. We've been vaccinated. We've been sick. We have bundles and bundles of data at this point, and you can't even explain how you're testing for a variant. You just sort of smugly tell us talking point statistics and say, we're going to shut down things again. And now we start hearing these rumors of Team Biden in the White House working on a new shutdown strategy and policy. It just seems like the worst possible thing for our country, our economy, and everything else. And we still haven't even been able to tell the truth. It's taking the minority report from the Congress to say, once again, this came from China. While we're watching the Tokyo 2020 Olympics that are happening in 2021 because of China, but don't talk about it. But the saving grace was the Taiwanese defeated them in badminton over the weekend. So there is some karma in the world.
There is. There's a little bit of, and that's a great point too. Here, something caused by China, and you have the Tokyo 2020. It's kind of jarring to see that. It's an ever-present reminder of how weird everything has gotten. But we're still going full speed ahead, apparently, with Olympics in Beijing. How is this even? How is this even happening? Surely, Stephen, there have to be other countries that are kind of scratching their heads and maybe vocalizing, against this a little bit, right?
You would think. But in a way, it's only the smallest of countries that are out there that have lived with what real communism, real authoritarianism is. I mean, in Europe, the most vocal and courageous of the countries is Lithuania. They have been very open about having a normal relationship and communication about Taiwan. They've been very, very clear about the evils of stomping on promises of democracy and freedom in Hong Kong, very clear about having ethical supply chains, clean technology. They say the same kinds of clear things about Russia and other places too. So, I mean, really, in some ways, the world would do much better for itself if it listened to some of these smaller voices. Instead of claiming to represent minorities, actually listen to what some of these experienced minorities have to say in the world. But right now, I'm just gobsmacked about the Olympic situation. I grew up actually inspired when Bruce Jenner won the decathlon. I grew up inspired by the Miracle on Ice, by watching the fastest people on the planet just blow doors on the track. And now all the copy is about a population-free stadium, people who are losing or backing out, and coming up with some form of demonstration. It's sad in so many ways. But no way in the world should the Olympics go back to China in 2022. And if they do, no one should follow.
No one should follow. I'm going to come back to China in a minute, but you mentioned some of the athletes that had to drop out, or I know that there was and she has got a lot of consonants in her name, and I think her last name is 5 syllables alone, from Belarus, the sprinter from Belarus who disagreed with her coaches on something. The next thing she knew, she's being packed up. I mean, actually packed up. Someone's packing her and they take her to the airport. She ran to Japanese police to say that they were trying to get her to go back to Belarus against her will. And she said that it was a kidnapping. And this comes because for people who might have forgotten, Lukashenko, who heads up Belarus, he was they were the one who they intercepted the plane that had this journalist that was very critical of Russia. I know he's besties basically with Vladimir Putin, and they call him one of the last tyrants there. Tell us a little bit about this, because to me, it's still stunning, and I think it's kind of still an example of just how far. I know everyone sort of looks at Russia as maybe being, kind of defeated, but it's that ideology that's still ever present, the same ideology that you see in China and Belarus. They're acting like I'm just shocked that this continues in 2021.
Well, it shouldn't be happening, and it shouldn't be happening at the Olympics. I mean, there is history of bad things happening at the Olympics going back many episodes where there have been hijackings and other kinds of crimes committed. This is another one of those things where I don't want to depress everyone who's watching and listening again, but it's just a reminder of how willfully the dominant ruling class of the world is to be distracted or soothed with the sounds of their own voices, and will pay attention to what a very comfortable Germany has to say, but will ignore a very clear and blatant problem in Belarus. And again, not to beat the same drum twice, but Lithuania is having an immigration problem of people getting pushed out, fleeing authoritarianism and other things into their small geography because of what's happening there. And the EU couldn't possibly be bothered by this because they have to work on pipelines and talk about mood music and engaging Iran and other kinds of topics. And it's saddening, but it is very real that the ruling class is so distracted and diverting attention away from these things. And whether it's the working class in America or the working class of Europe, there's still real threats out there. And I feel like we have an obligation to try to speak up for them.
I completely agree. Talking with Stephen Yates at YatesComms on Twitter. Is the Iran deal dead with this administration? I know they have new leadership that's coming in, but it seems like they're very, very resistant, not just to the Biden administration, but the U.S. even more so than previously.
Well, sometimes Hollywood and comedy is closer to reality. This just reminds me of The Princess Bride and the argument about, is he dead or mostly dead? And is there some kind of a pill that can bring back the mostly dead? And we're at this kind of stage where the Biden administration is taking something that couldn't in any way, shape, or form pass the United States Senate as a treaty. That has plenty of evidence to say that there are problems. The new government in Israel that the Biden administration lauded because they detested Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu so much, now is saying that there's grave concerns and that no new deals should be entered into with Iran that don't take into account the broader security challenges that Iran is presenting. So, I mean, this is just a clown car crashing in every possible direction. And so I think it's definitely mostly dead. But because we have the Biden administration, we might have Billy Crystal and a partner coming in and giving it that one last magical shot. And they just seem to keep going and going and going for it. It's bad for our interests. It's bad for our allies. It's one thing if you're going to try to criticize Trump policy, at least Trump had maximum pressure on Iran and then dealt with the allies. This is unleashing Iran and not really corralling our allies. It's the worst of both possible options.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of worst of both possible options, talking with Stephen Yates. So Newsweek had a piece, China, Russia training together against terror as U.S. troops exit Afghanistan. I don't like China and Russia doing anything together. They already share a horrible ideology. I mean, let's leave it at that. I mean, if we have to have something.
Right. Well, most of my life, there has been concern and kind of talk about Russia and China doing things together. And sort of out of that concern was born one of the worst foreign policy decisions of my lifetime. And that was the accommodation of the Communist Party in China in order to balance against the Soviet Union. So there's a deep part of my experience that makes me skeptical of what people will do to try to separate these two powers from doing things. At the same time, anyone with a brain knows that when these governments are talking about terrorism, all they're talking about is who terrifies them. They're not really talking about terrorism the way we mean by innocent people being victims of random acts of violence. They are specifically talking about the people who terrify their ability to maintain total control. And so there's every reason to be skeptical of what those things could be about. I think that we should play mind games, play real games, counter program, whatever else. But just the main thing is not to be fooled. When Russia and China say they're fighting terrorism, that's not what it's about.
Ooh, definitely not. Not what it's about is no. Yeah, they're not fighting. They are the terrorists. You can't fight. I mean, you're fighting yourself at that point. One last quick thing, just a headline of different. A headline of actually an assortment of different headlines rather. President Xi Jinping still cracking down on anything that gets in before or is a hurdle, an obstacle to the Communist Party of China, whether it is still cracking down on Hong Kong or even now at this point. And this, I was unaware of this, the way that they would abuse Interpol to try to go after those, whether it was Muslim Uyghurs, whatever it was. I didn't realize that it makes sense, but I did not realize that they were trying to get influence within Interpol to use them as an extra arm of Beijing. What can you tell us about this?
Well, it's basically part of a piece in that every international organization that China becomes a part of, they seek to use as a tool to advance their own agenda. That's what they did with the UN General Assembly. That's what they do with the Security Council. If they're on a human rights body or whatever, that's what they do. It's what they did with the World Trade Organization, what they did with the World Health Organization. And so it really would be a surprise if they didn't do things like this. The Interpol part is creepy and scary in a certain sense because they've even made the former head of Interpol, that was supposed to be their tool, disappear from the face of the earth. And so their ability to manipulate these organizations is beyond anyone's real comprehension. And there's been no coverage of what anyone even knows about where the former head of Interpol is, what was the root cause of sort of disappearing from public service in that position. And so it's not just using these tools for their purposes. If you don't toe their line, you just get disappeared, and there's no sort of accountability or follow through.
That's beyond creepy. I mean, it's the head of Interpol. This is the agency that's in every spy movie, and they're like supposed to be the tough guys who come in. They help James Bond or whomever. Now that the head of Interpol can be disappeared, anybody could be the head of anybody. Anything could be disappeared by the communists in China.
The ultimate deplatforming goes beyond YouTube, Facebook, everything. The Chinese Communist Party's been there, done that, and is way less ashamed about doing whatever it takes.
Wow. And they're looking at everyone else as we engage in the baby deplatforming. They're like, no, we can deplatform people from life. It's the ultimate deplatforming. Good heavens. Stephen Yates, always a pleasure to see you, my friend, at YatesComms on Twitter. Have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Take good care.
You too.